morning talked about the First World War.
Good morning, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Ranch in Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Butterfly. Alright, today I'm going to carve in a sky. It's going to be a light, sort of twilight, bluish purple with a little twist of cerulean, and make another row of jagged mountains as I carve it in, set it in the sun, and then if there's time I'm going to take a little orange and start working on highlights in the lower stones.
Everywhere, millions of people cheered on the onset of war. Everywhere they marched enthusiastically on behalf of their flag. Everywhere the Catholic priests and Protestant ministers of every denomination blessed their armies and blessed their flags. And the result was 20 million people slaughtered in 4 years. And in some of these countries, there were individuals in Britain, in Russia, in Germany, in the United States, on all sides, who said this is madness. Why are we slaughtering each other? Why are we sending our young people to murder and to die? And in every one of these countries, those few people that said that were jailed as traitors and criminals. So when we look at the world today, I think it behooves us to ask ourselves, well, what is it that allows some people to think for themselves and to be able to stand apart from the herd and to actually speak up in the face of popular disdain and even hatred, and even at the risk of their own freedom? And that's something that allows them to do that, surely is the capacity to be honest to themselves, to be true to themselves, to be themselves. And that thing of being ourselves, or that process of being ourselves, being truly ourselves, meaning that we know what our values are, trusting ourselves, and not being intimidated by how alone we might be in that assertion of our true selves. That's a very rare quality. It's a very rare quality. It's very difficult to attain. Let me give you a personal story. When I was about 20, I was far from knowing myself. I was far away from knowing myself as I could possibly have been. And I had an aunt who had come back from Auschwitz, and she was an ophthalmologist. And she could see me very clearly. She could see my inauthenticity very clearly. And she sent me a letter once when I was 20. And she said, and she quoted Shakespeare. She quoted Polonius, the character from the play Hamlet, who very famously said, "To thine own self be true, and then it follows this night today that you can't be false to any man." Now, there's a double irony in the story I just told you, because Polonius himself is a very false character. He's a buffoon, he's a toady, he's a spy, he's an abject courtier, but he speaks this absolute truth. My aunt, who sent me that quote, I found out only after her death that she's been a closeted lesbian all her life. So she lived a completely inauthentic life. I'm not blaming the poor woman, how she must have suffered. And in the world of those days, particularly in Eastern Europe, you just could not be a lesbian. So here's my aunt, who all her life was forced to betray herself, quoted to me this character who himself was utterly inauthentic. These very beautiful words about authenticity, about being true to ourselves. That, people, is how difficult it is. That's how difficult it is. And certainly, my journey, if it's involved anything, it's involved stepping into myself as best I could. And it's an ongoing process. And sometimes when people come up to me and they tell me how much my work has meant to them, and thank you, your books changed my life, and my response is, gee, maybe I should read it myself, because I'm far from I'm far from embodying all the stuff that I talk about in my daily life. So it's a difficult process, but I think it's well, I don't think, it's an absolutely essential one. And the surrender of authenticity, the surrender of who we actually are, exacts a heavy price. Let me read you a couple of quotes from my new book. This is the singer and songwriter and musical megastar Sheryl Crow, who had, as you may have heard, she had breast cancer. And here's what she learned through her cancer. She says, "Surviving breast cancer redefined who I am and how I am. Until then, I'd spent a lifetime being a caretaker for everyone around me. From then, I started to put myself first. I had voices at the back of my head telling me that whatever I did wasn't good enough. Now I have finally silenced them," she said. Now I don't recommend getting disease as a teacher, but it often is. And I'll go to somebody else. This is another woman who's quite famous. Her name is Anita Moorjani, and Anita is now 61 years old. When she was 41, she had terminal lymphoma. She was in the ICU. She heard the doctors telling her husband that she's only got her organs were shutting down. She heard the doctors telling her that she only had a few days to live. And then she had her near-death experience, where she actually saw her whole life. She wrote a book called Dying to Be Me. Now get the meaning of that sentence, dying to. She literally had to nearly die to become herself. The terminal lymphoma that's supposed to have killed her 20 years ago, long gone, and she's here, very vibrant and active, and a very lovely personality. And she told me that the person I was before I got cancer was afraid of disappointing other people. I was a pleaser. I completely lost myself in satisfying other people. I became so drained. I was someone who could not say no. I was a rescuer, and I would be the one who was there for everyone. I didn't even learn that it's okay to be me when I had cancer. It took being in a coma to learn that. Because she was in a coma where she had her near-death experience. So this flight from the self, we're not talking about some new age, airy-fairy concept here. We're talking about something very practical. And the flight from the self, where people allow themselves, unwittingly perhaps, to be manipulated into wars, into beliefs, into loyalties that don't serve them. That dominates our world. I mean, how many people actually want the earth to be destroyed? Even the oil company executives don't want it to be destroyed. They just don't care if it is, for the sake of profit. But how many people actually want it? How many people really want wars to go on? And yet, as we all know all too well, wars do go on. And by the way, not just in Eastern Europe, but elsewhere as well, exacting a terrible death toll. It's not because anybody wants it. Not most people, but most people are hypnotized into passivity in the face of all that. They're so divorced from their own selves that even seeing horrible things happen to their loved ones or to the earth doesn't shake people out of their lethargy. Well, what accounts for that? How does that happen? As a infant survivor of the Nazi genocide in Eastern Europe, I grew up with this question: how can people suffer so much, and how can they make other people suffer so much? I had to laugh when Wade was talking about his experience of God as a young child, because I figured in Eastern Europe, in communist Eastern Europe, I grew up in Hungary, there used to be a joke about, which said that you could be honest or intelligent or a member of the Communist Party. As a matter of fact, you could be any two of those three things, but not all three at the same time. Now, I had the same take on God when I was a kid. God could be omniscient. He, she, they could know everything. It could be omnipotent and all good. In fact, any two of those three things. But not all three at the same time. It couldn't be good, all-knowing, and all-powerful. Because if they're all-powerful, they're not good. So that was my child's logic. And that actually was logically completely right. But it's, for a long time, it's separated from the sacred that we just heard Ray talk about. So, what is it then that even awakens people to the necessity to seek authenticity, to seek their true selves? Well, usually there's three types of wake-up calls. There's failure, you just keep failing, and at some point you have to keep asking yourself, is it me, or is it I'm just unlucky, or am I doing something wrong? And then you have to start asking questions. But a much more devastating teacher is success. Because as long as you're failing, you can still believe, well, if I only succeeded, then I'd be happy and I'd be fulfilled and I'd be grounded and I'd be who I needed to be. But when success happens, and you still don't feel fulfilled, and you still don't feel that you arrived anywhere, and you still don't feel that you belong, and you still don't feel that you know yourself, that's a powerful wake-up call. I was in my 40s, and by all standards of the world, I was successful. I was a physician, I had well-paying, remunerative employment. I was married, I had children, nice home, and I was really unhappy, depressed as a matter of fact, and convinced that I was nowhere near my potential. But when I heard Alexander talk this morning, talking about purpose, I had no idea what my purpose was. I had no idea what my purpose was. So success can be a powerful wake-up call. I bet, looking at this fairly well-heeled audience that I'm addressing at the moment, I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. You've achieved a fair degree of success in your worldly endeavors, and you're still looking for yourself. And the third kind of wake-up call is usually some kind of a crisis. The Greek playwright Aeschylus, in his play The Agamemnon, he said that the way the Zeus, the god, created us, human beings, is that we have to suffer into the truth. And just as Anita Murjani and Sheryl Crow had to suffer into the truth, so do many of us. So some kind of a crisis. That crisis could be disease. And I'm telling you, I don't recommend it, but I've seen it function as a very powerful wake-up call to people to seek themselves. I'll say more about that in a little while. It could also be some life challenge, like a divorce, a broken relationship. It can be just your ordinary run-of-the-mill midlife crisis. The world's most famous example of midlife crisis is Dante Alighieri, the great medieval Italian poet, who begins his Inferno, the first three books of his Divine Comedy, with the line, midway through life's way, I lost my path. And I don't know why I ended up in that dark forest. So he actually begins with a midlife crisis. And he realizes he doesn't know himself, he doesn't know his potential, he doesn't know the sacred. And the Divine Comedy has three books. There's Inferno, which is hell. Then there's Purgatory, which is purgatory, where you get cleansed. And then there's Paradiso, paradise, heaven. He doesn't go straight to heaven, does he? Where does he have to go? He has to go through hell first. He has to go through all the layers of suffering that the psyche is capable of. And he has to get to know them. And he has to get past them. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that authenticity and becoming ourselves is not simply a pious wish, nor is it a question of positive affirmations. Today I'm going to be true to myself. Well, I could tell myself that till the cows come home. But it wouldn't get you one step closer to myself. You have to go through the stuff, the difficult dark stuff. That's how you get to know yourself. Which then brings up the very question of how do we lose ourselves in the first place? And why do we lose ourselves? Well, one reason is very obvious, and Wade actually alluded to it. I just finished reading a novel by a British Columbia indigenous writer called Richard Macy. In this, he talks about the horrific experience of the residential schools. Now, just 2 months ago, I was in a ceremony with a group of indigenous leaders. It was a mushroom, a psilocybin ceremony. And the sorrow, the grief that these people hold, it's unbelievable. But what's also unbelievable is their connection to nature, their connection to spirit, to the sacred, their dignity, their love, and their welcoming spirit. It was an extraordinary experience. And one of those people that was there was about to travel to Italy to meet with the Pope. A group of indigenous leaders traveled to Italy so the Pope would apologize for what the church did to their children for over 100 years. The punishment for being authentic for a native child, and there's nothing more authentic than speaking your own language. The punishment for being authentic for a 4-year-old child that I know, she's in her 60s now. She was an alcoholic by the time she was 9 years old. First day in residential school in British Columbia, when I was in my teens, and I had no idea this was going on. She spoke her native language. The teacher stuck a pin through her tongue. And for a whole hour, this little girl sat there, unable to put her tongue back in her mouth because she would cut her lips. And that's before the sexual abuse began. That was the price they had to pay for being themselves. And so, in this book, the chief character, the leading character says, I discovered that being someone you are not is often easier than living with the person you are. So for him, and for many others, that flight from the self is simply a survival technique. When being yourself exacts more pain and presents more danger than becoming someone else. Now, horrific is the experiences that his people suffered and that he depicts in his book. That experience of having to give up who you are for the sake of avoiding more suffering is very common. In fact, I would say it affects more people. Not in such a dramatic and horrendous way, but it does anyway, for a very simple reason. And before I go there, let me just read you a few examples of what I'm talking about. So, I had this fascination with obituaries, and the reason is because they tell a lot about people. And just as with Anita Moorjani and Shel Crow, that flight from the self, that suppression of the real self, is actually a source of physiological disease. Documentedly so. I'm not going to go into the physiology of it for you, but the science is fairly clear what should actually be the case. It simply has to do with the mind-body unity. You can't separate the mind from the body. In fact, even to say that they're connected is false, because that implies that two separate entities are connected. They're not connected, they're the same thing. They're not exactly the same thing, they're one unit. And a really brilliant American researcher called it body-mind. So I read the newspaper for these articles. The first one is not an obituary. The first one is written by a woman who's just been diagnosed with breast cancer. And this is her first person story from a Canadian newspaper. Her doctor's name is Harold, and her husband's name is Hy. And High's first wife died of breast cancer, and now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. And she writes, this is her first personal account. And she has no idea what she's saying. Harold tells me that the lump is small, and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of High's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. So you're not going to die here, reassured me. But I'm worried about High, I say. I won't have the strength to support him. Now what's wrong with this picture? Now she's the one that's going to have to go through chemotherapy, perhaps radiation surgery, and her first thought is how will I support my husband? Now that automatic concern for the needs of others, ignoring one's own, is number one, a sign of the flight from the authentic self, and number two, it's a significant source of physiological pathology. The others are obituaries, and obituaries are interesting because they tell you about what we value in each other. And there's the expression in English that the good die young. Well, actually, often that's true. And the reason they die is because they are too good in a certain sense. Because their goodness represents not authentic compassion, empathy, and wisdom. It represents a flight from the self. They're afraid not to be good, that's what it is. So this man is a physician. He died at age 55 of cancer, and the obituary said, never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. Now what would you tell a friend of yours? Just forget about it. Go back to work and don't think for a minute about what your needs might be. That rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility, rather than the needs of the authentic self, is a major risk factor for illness, both of body and mind. And I can totally relate to it. I mean, in my days as a workaholic doctor, I never said no to anything. My identity was totally hinged on my work. And identity is an interesting word because it's from two Latin words. Idem, which means the same, and facere, which means to make. So when you make yourself the same, as you do your own responsibility, you disappear as a human being with your own emotions and your own truths. You just become that thing that you do. Major risk factor for college. The third obituary is really telling because it celebrates people who are super nice. And people who are super nice, I always worry about them because I can see the writing on the wall. This is the
Alright, so that sets up the sky color, a sun, and or possibly a moon, and begins the texture of the water detail. So I think that's it for the moment. Thanks for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting for the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting butterfly. Have a good day, Earth.
Those of you